Of course, we have the pyramids of Giza, which is probably most well known to people, and the largest of the three bigger pyramids at that site, I should say, is of course one of the only standing ancient wonders of the world as well, that featured on a lot of ancient wonder lists. How do you feel people have seen the pyramids back in ancient times and even more?
I think they've always been something which is just sort of massively in your face, and also they've been a sort of a tourist attraction throughout. Even in ancient times, we've got tourist graffiti from ancient Egypt on some of these pyramids locations. But from fairly early on, people looking from the outside, there's always this feeling there might be something more. And of course, that has led to, in modern times, all sorts of bizarre ideas about what the pyramids are. In fact, half of it is seeing these things through a lens of your own time. Back in medieval times, the pyramids were seen as the granaries built by Joseph, as talked about in the Old Testament, because that was something which was monuments to known of in Egypt, and then they put two and two together and made six in this particular case. And again, the idea that they are something largely practical is always difficult to try to get a handle on. And though people who don't understand sort of the Egyptian conceptions of solar belief and so on, which immediately leads Egyptologists down this line of what they actually mean, you have people who just have no understanding of any of that and will suddenly jump at almost anything, And then, of course, it leads to the sort of ancient aliens hypotheses, or the idea that these things are power plants. In fact, it was a tour guide in Egypt telling me, because of the way all the granite and limestone work together, the Great Pyramid can produce power. Sorry, where did that come from? But there's a whole. But the whole point, there's so much in your face that people feel they have to be something more than just simply what they really actually are.
Okay, well, you've mentioned aliens, which unfortunately comes up a lot around pyramids, but maybe we should introduce why that's not a possibility and talk about what we know about how the pyramids were built.
Okay. As far as the building of pyramids are concerned, we unfortunately have no ancient text which tells us how they do it. But we can infer quite a bit from what we do know about Egyptian practice, and also from remains which are still present archaeologically. For example, we have a number of unfinished pyramids, and the remains of those unfinished pyramids are covered with ramps, clearly which are to be used to raise stones up to a particular level. And that does tie in nicely with some papyri, where they're talking about calculating ramp angles and so on. These are much later than the pyramids, but clearly it indicates that ramps are the way an Egyptian engineer gets anything up to a higher level. So we can take that fairly well as read. As far as the mechanics of it, who's doing these things, well, we have the barracks of at least two pyramid building teams. There's one set at Giza near the Great Pyramid. There's also another one at Kahun, close to a Middle Kingdom pyramid site. So clearly we know that there are establishments of people who are doing this kind of thing. We also know where the stone comes from. Most of the stone comes from virtually next door to the pyramid itself. When you go to somewhere like Giza, you notice there's a huge hole, effectively, in between the two great pyramids, and that is where the stone came from.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Indeed. But there's also, of course, your more upmarket stone. There's going to be the fine quality limestone for the outer casing. There's going to be granite, basalt, and other stones for paving and adorning the temples particularly. And those had to be brought in from elsewhere. The limestone from the outside comes from directly on the other side of the river from pyramid sites. And here, what's really exciting was a few years ago, some papyri were found on the Red Sea of all places, which included a ship's log of people who were actually carrying this limestone from one side of the Nile to the other. the Wadi Jaf papyri, which suddenly opens a whole new vista on our understanding of these things. And what's even more exciting is that these are actually the oldest written papyri ever found, and they're actually written by an eyewitness, the building of the Great Pyramid.
It's quite incredible how, one discovery can change our understanding of history.
But it does show that where you get the evidence you wouldn't expect to find the evidence for the construction process of the pyramids on the Red Sea. But this happened, he was a boat captain. Some of his job was to take boats down the Red Sea. He also worked on the Nile. And so presumably he kept his logbooks with him, and they eventually ended up while he was working on the Red Sea. So that's an interesting sort of thing around there. And we can also infer stuff about how the process worked by looking at how later workmen are organised. Much later, we've got the village of Deir el-Medina, the people who build the Valley of Kings' tombs. Now, of course, they're cutting underground passages, not building pyramids, but the organisation into teams and so on is all part of that. And that team structure is reflected by quarry marks, which we find on stones of pyramids, whereby it notes basically which team was responsible for moving that particular block. So all of this ties together so we understand that it's a huge project management task. And I think the key point to understand about building pyramids or anything else in ancient Egypt is that they were good project managers. And also the fact that when you see these structures, there's an evolution going on so that each generation learns from the last. And that's part of the Egyptian society, is whereby you did the job your dad did. Therefore, if your dad built pyramids, you did. And the point is that once you probably could toddle, you went off and sat watching your dad, your uncles, and everybody else building pyramids. So therefore, all those kinds of trade secrets, if you like, you just exactly know where you need to bang something so it will, all those kinds of things. So that's what you've got. You've got generations of people, and that engineering expertise is reinforced generation after generation after generation. And that's how it all works. But these, of course, are the skilled individuals. They are not going to waste their time moving just lots of raw materials. And although there's no doubt documentation which proves this, it's strongly suspected that the moving of using sort of the basic labour probably took place during the flooding of the Nile every year, when the fields were all covered with water, and therefore you had all the farm labourers were effectively unable to work for a number of months. It's strongly suspected that they were then conscripted to do the donkey work, almost literally. They were the ones who would be dragging blocks around so that when the waters went down and they could go and go back to the fields, all the blocks were in a location whereby the skilled labourers could then pick up and move them on. And another thing about the inundation is also it means that if you're bringing in the stone from outside, on the other side of the Nile from the point of view of the limestone, or from the other end of Egypt for granite and things like that, when the Nile has flooded, the river is going right up the edge of the desert. So therefore, you can actually, again, during that period, you're probably putting all effort into getting barges and so on up to the desert edge on that before the water goes down. So again, everything is ready. So the late summer, autumn is probably when all your stuff is being put into locations. And then over the winter on and into the spring is when the skilled labourers are getting on and doing it.
That's so interesting. And talking about those skilled labourers learning generational skills, I mean, that's reflected in Egyptian workers on archaeological sites today. So a lot of them have studied under their own fathers or grandfathers and continued to do archaeological skills rather than the engineering skills. But I mean, it shows how history repeats itself. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's the whole point. It's in learning. And that's one of the reasons why so many societies have you do the same thing your father did. It's partly social conservatism there, but it's simply how it works.
Yeah, you learn from your closest relatives most, don't you?
Yeah.
Very interesting. And of course, you talked about possible ideas about who are moving these blocks. So counter to popular belief, we don't think it's slaves that built the pyramids.
Yeah. Of course, the big question of how you define slave. There's another little issue here.
Yes.
Because these people these farmers who, if they're conscripted to do this, probably didn't necessarily want to do that.
No.
So whether you could argue they are slaves in those days, but the point is they are not individuals who only do that and are being forced to do it. I think it's a problem where we're just trying to impose a concept which is actually fundamentally sort of Roman, of slavery, and then how it's then been deployed in more modern times to try to use that word. And I think there's always a big problem with dealing with pre-modern civilizations is what words we use. I've already mentioned this whole question about what God means. So there's one word in the Egyptian, Necha, but for us that would cover everything from God, demon, saint, all those kind of things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's so important to think about our own cultural biases at these points because meanings change so much over time.